Picture this. You're walking through the marble corridors of the imperial palace in Rome, and the year is 220 AD. The sound that reaches your ears makes your blood run cold, a mixture of screaming and laughter echoing from the emperor's private chambers. Behind those golden walls, one of history's youngest and most depraved rulers is conducting what he calls a marriage ceremony. But what you're about to witness represents one of the most disturbing acts of sexual obsession and brutal violence in recorded history. The bride wears silk and jewels, painted face gleaming in torchlight, but whispers follow in the wake because everyone knows the horrifying truth. That beautiful young woman standing beside the most powerful man in the world was born a boy named Hierocles, and what Emperor Elagabalus did to him, and what he would eventually do to him, represents a love story so twisted that it would make the gods themselves weep. Before diving into these forgotten stories of obsession and cruelty, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the darkest chapters of human nature. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of Roman excess. It's the story of how absolute power can transform love into possession, desire into destruction, and a human being into a living doll created to serve one man's most twisted fantasies. The name Elagabalus might not be familiar to you, but his story will haunt you long after you finish listening. Let's start with the boy who would become the architect of this tragedy. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, known to history as Elagabalus, wasn't born to rule. In fact, his path to the throne was paved with lies, manipulation, and the kind of political scheming that would make Machiavelli blush. When he ascended to power at just 14 years old in 218 AD, many Romans believed they were witnessing either a divine miracle or a cosmic joke. The boy emperor came from Syria, from a family of sun god priests who worshipped Elagabal, a black stone meteorite that they believed contained the essence of divine masculine power. But there was something fundamentally broken about young Elagabalus from the very beginning. Maybe it was growing up in a world where religious ecstasy and sexual frenzy were considered forms of worship. Maybe it was the isolation of being declared a living god before his voice had even changed. Or maybe it was something darker, the kind of psychological damage that comes from being raised by women who saw him not as a child, but as a weapon to be wielded against their enemies. His grandmother, Julia Mesa, was the true power behind the throne, a woman so ruthless and ambitious that she had orchestrated the murder of the previous emperor just to place her grandson in power. His mother, Julia Soaemias, was a woman of voracious appetites who openly flaunted her affairs and had taught her son that power meant never having to deny yourself anything. Under their influence, Elagabalus learned early that the difference between love and ownership was purely semantic. But the real corruption began when 14-year-old Elagabalus first laid eyes on the gladiator schools of Rome. He had come to witness the games, to show himself to the people as their new divine ruler. Instead, he became obsessed with one particular fighter, a blonde, blue-eyed young man named Hierocles, probably no more than 16 or 17 years old. Where most Romans saw a piece of fighting meat destined for a brutal death, Elagabalus saw something that made his heart race and his young body respond in ways he didn't fully understand. Hierocles wasn't just beautiful, though his beauty was legendary even among the other gladiators. He possessed that particular combination of masculine strength and vulnerable youth that would drive the emperor to acts of increasing desperation. During that first encounter, as Hierocles fought and killed his opponent with methodical precision, something clicked in Elagabalus's developing mind. Here was someone who could give him what he had never experienced, genuine fear mixed with genuine desire. The emperor's first command as absolute ruler of Rome was simple: purchase Hierocles and bring him to the palace, not as a gladiator, not as a performer, but as what Elagabalus called his personal companion. The transaction was conducted with the same casual efficiency that Romans used to buy bread or wine. Hierocles, blood still fresh on his hands from his latest victory, was informed that his life now belonged to a teenage emperor who had been watching him with the intensity of a hawk studying prey. What happened during their first private meeting has been debated by historians for centuries, but the outcome was always the same. Within hours of arriving at the palace, Hierocles had gone from being a slave destined for death in the arena to being the unofficial consort of the most powerful person in the known world. Ancient sources describe the transformation as almost supernatural, the way a hardened killer became suddenly docile, the way a young emperor who had shown no interest in governance became obsessed with a single human being. But Elagabalus's love wasn't the kind that poets celebrate or historians romanticize. It was the love of ownership, the love of someone who had confused desire with dominance. The emperor didn't want to be with Hierocles. He wanted to become him, to possess him so completely that the distinction between self and other disappeared entirely. This obsession would drive him to increasingly bizarre and cruel experiments in what he called marital harmony. The first sign of the emperor's deteriorating grip on reality came when he announced his intention to marry Hierocles in a full imperial ceremony. This wasn't just shocking to Roman sensibilities, it was incomprehensible. Roman law didn't recognize marriages between men, particularly not between an emperor and a slave. But Elagabalus had convinced himself that he was not just above the law, but above nature itself. The preparations for the wedding took months and consumed enormous resources from the imperial treasury. Elagabalus commissioned the finest seamstresses in the empire to create wedding garments that would transform him into what he called a proper bride. These weren't just ceremonial costumes. They were elaborate disguises designed to feminize the emperor's already delicate features and create the illusion that this was a traditional Roman wedding between a man and a woman. The emperor spent hours each day learning to walk, sit, and gesture in what he considered appropriately feminine ways. He practiced speaking in higher tones, applying cosmetics to soften his features, and arranging his hair in the elaborate styles fashionable among aristocratic Roman women. This wasn't just performance. It was a systematic erasure of his own identity in service of a fantasy that became more real to him than the empire he was supposed to govern. Meanwhile, Hierocles was receiving his own form of training. Palace instructors taught him how to comport himself as the husband in this bizarre arrangement. He learned court protocol, studied Roman law and custom, and was given lessons in the kind of sophisticated conversation expected from someone who would be sitting beside the emperor at state functions. But perhaps most importantly, he was taught to see Elagabalus not as his master, but as his wife. A psychological shift that would have devastating consequences for both of them. The wedding ceremony itself was conducted in the spring of 221 AD, timed to coincide with religious festivals that would add ceremonial weight to what the emperor considered the most important day of his life. The event was held in the largest hall of the imperial palace, decorated with thousands of imported flowers and illuminated by oil lamps that turned night into day. Musicians played traditional wedding songs while the finest cooks in Rome prepared elaborate feasts that would have fed entire legions. To the outside observers who didn't know the full story, it might have looked like a magnificent imperial wedding worthy of the greatest emperor in Roman history. Elagabalus, dressed in silk and jewels with his face painted according to the finest cosmetic arts, appeared every inch the radiant bride. Hierocles, garbed in purple and gold with a crown specially crafted for the occasion, looked like a god descended from Olympus to claim his divine consort. But those in the know understood they were witnessing something unprecedented and deeply disturbing. Here was the most powerful man in the world publicly marrying a teenage gladiator while dressed as a woman, treating this union as if it were sanctioned by both law and custom. The ceremony included all traditional Roman rituals, exchanging vows, joining hands, sharing sacred bread, signing legal documents that made this union as official as the emperor's divine authority could make it. The guests played their parts with accomplished acting skills, offering congratulations and expensive gifts while maintaining appropriately joyful expressions. But the atmosphere must have been thick with barely concealed horror, fascination, and the nervous energy that comes from participating in something fundamentally wrong. Roman senators who had dedicated their lives to preserving tradition found themselves celebrating its complete destruction. Military commanders who had conquered barbarian tribes in the name of Roman virtue watched their emperor embrace what they saw as the ultimate barbarism. Following the wedding, Elagabalus treated Hierocles exactly as he would a legitimate empress. The young gladiator received his own household staff, luxurious quarters within the palace complex, and an income from the imperial treasury that made him wealthier than most provincial governors. He had his own litter for traveling, horses bred for racing, and a retinue of supporters who understood that their fortunes were now tied to pleasing the emperor's new wife. But all this apparent luxury came with a terrible price: complete surrender to Elagabalus's increasingly unstable fantasies. Hierocles was expected to accompany the emperor to public functions, sit beside him at state dinners, and play the devoted wife in all their interactions. This wasn't just about appearances. Elagabalus genuinely seemed to believe he had successfully transformed himself into a woman and Hierocles into his husband through sheer force of imperial will. For Hierocles, every day became a high-stakes performance where the slightest mistake could mean death. He had to remember not just how to act like a Roman husband, but how to respond to Elagabalus's rapidly shifting moods and increasingly bizarre demands. Ancient sources describe the young man as becoming almost supernaturally skilled at reading the emperor's emotional state, developing an ability to anticipate needs and deflect anger that bordered on the psychic. But they also note that Hierocles began to change in more disturbing ways as the months passed. The gladiator who had once killed men for sport started to discover that he enjoyed wielding power over the emperor. The slave who had been purchased for his beauty began to understand that his master's obsession made him virtually untouchable. The frightened young man who had been thrust into an impossible situation slowly transformed into something darker, someone who understood that love and fear were just different words for the same kind of control. The first signs of trouble came when Hierocles began testing the limits of his influence over Elagabalus. He would make increasingly outrageous demands for more luxurious quarters, for higher-ranking servants, for the right to attend Senate meetings as the emperor's equal. Each time, Elagabalus would comply with desperate eagerness, interpreting these power games as evidence of his husband's growing affection. But Hierocles was learning something that would ultimately destroy them both. Absolute power over another person is the most corrupting force in human experience. The young man who had once been property began to see his master not as a person, but as a source of pleasure and convenience. The slave became the owner, but in the most twisted way possible, through the complete emotional enslavement of someone who held the power of life and death over millions. The psychological dynamics of their relationship became increasingly complex and disturbing. Elagabalus, desperate to maintain the fiction that he was a beloved wife, began allowing Hierocles to treat him with casual cruelty. What started as playful dominance games evolved into something much darker. The emperor would beg for his husband's attention, accept verbal abuse as evidence of passionate love, and interpret physical violence as a sign of masculine strength. Ancient sources describe scenes that would shock even the most jaded observers of imperial excess. Hierocles would strike Elagabalus during public ceremonies, and the emperor would apologize for provoking his husband's anger. The young gladiator would openly mock his master's appearance or intelligence, and Elagabalus would laugh as if he had been paid the greatest compliment. Most disturbing of all, Hierocles began to demand increasingly degrading sexual performances from the emperor, treating their private moments as opportunities to exact revenge for his own enslavement. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of their relationship was how completely it consumed both of their identities. Elagabalus stopped governing entirely, leaving the empire in the hands of advisors while he focused obsessively on pleasing his husband. Hierocles, meanwhile, lost all connection to the person he had been before entering the palace. The gladiator who had once fought for his life became a different kind of performer, one whose survival depended on maintaining the emperor's delusions while simultaneously exploiting them. As 221 AD progressed into 222, their relationship reached new levels of dysfunction that amazed even the cynical palace staff who had thought they had seen everything. Hierocles began bringing other men to their private chambers, forcing Elagabalus to watch as he conducted affairs that the emperor was required to accept as evidence of his husband's virility. The young gladiator would disappear for days at a time, leaving Elagabalus to pace the palace corridors like a abandoned wife waiting for her husband's return. The emperor's behavior during these absences revealed the complete psychological destruction that his obsession had wrought. He would refuse to eat, claiming that food had no taste without his beloved's presence. He would hold imaginary conversations with Hierocles, responding to questions that existed only in his deteriorating mind. Most pathetically, he would send servants throughout Rome with expensive gifts, begging them to convince his husband to return home. When Hierocles did return from these excursions, he would regale Elagabalus with detailed accounts of his sexual adventures, describing other partners in ways designed to inflict maximum emotional pain. The emperor would listen to these stories with the desperate attention of someone trying to extract love from torture, interpreting his husband's cruelty as proof of passionate temperament rather than sadistic manipulation. The Roman Senate and military leadership watched this spectacle with growing horror and determination. Here was an empire that controlled most of the known world, reduced to chaos because its leader was too obsessed with a abusive relationship to govern effectively. Barbarian tribes were mounting increasingly bold attacks on Roman territories, while Elagabalus spent his days begging for his husband's affection. Economic problems that required imperial attention were ignored, while the emperor focused on planning elaborate gifts for someone who treated him like a source of entertainment. But the final crisis came when Hierocles made a mistake that even Elagabalus's deteriorated mind couldn't rationalize away. During one of the emperor's public appearances, the young gladiator openly mocked his master in front of foreign ambassadors, referring to him as "my pathetic little wife," and suggesting that perhaps it was time to find a real man to share the imperial bed. The moment when Elagabalus finally understood what had been done to him, not just the humiliation, but the complete destruction of his identity in service of someone who felt nothing but contempt for him, was described by contemporary observers as one of the most heartbreaking sights in imperial history. The emperor's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, betrayal, and finally a rage so pure and cold that it seemed to change the very air in the room. What happened next has been the subject of historical debate for centuries, but the essential facts are clear. Within hours of that public humiliation, Hierocles was dead. Some sources suggest that Elagabalus strangled him personally in a fit of rage. Others claim that the emperor ordered his execution and watched his guards carried out the sentence. Still others whisper about poisoning, about a slower death designed to maximize suffering. But perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that Elagabalus killed Hierocles while they were making love, that the emperor's final act of intimacy with his husband was also an act of ultimate revenge. The image of those two young men, one 18, one barely 20, locked in an embrace that was simultaneously sexual and murderous, speaks to the complete corruption that absolute power had wrought in both their souls. The aftermath of Hierocles' death revealed the true extent of Elagabalus's psychological destruction. The emperor, who had spent months learning to be a wife, suddenly found himself a widow, mourning not just the loss of his beloved, but the death of the identity he had created around their relationship. Palace staff reported seeing him talking to Hierocles' corpse, planning future adventures that would never happen, apologizing for the anger that had led to murder. Elagabalus commissioned elaborate funeral rites that combined Roman tradition with Syrian religious practices, creating a ceremony that was meant to ensure Hierocles' transformation into a god who could be worshipped and consulted. The emperor declared his dead husband divine, established a cult in his honor, and spent days conducting conversations with statues and paintings as if they could provide the love that had been destroyed by his own hands. But the boy emperor's grief was short-lived. replaced quickly by a desperate search for someone who could fill the void that Hierocles had left behind. Within weeks of the murder, Elagabalus was scouring Rome for young men who bore even the slightest resemblance to his dead husband. He married again, this time to a man named Zodicus, in another elaborate ceremony that shocked even Romans who had thought themselves beyond shocking. Yet nothing could recapture the intensity of his relationship with Hierocles. Each subsequent marriage became increasingly desperate and violent, as Elagabalus tried to recreate the dynamic that had consumed his life while simultaneously punish new partners for not being the man he had murdered. The emperor's remaining time on the throne became a succession of brief, brutal relationships that ended when his current husband either fled in terror or was killed for failing to meet impossible standards. The Roman establishment had finally seen enough. In March of 222 AD, just 4 years after ascending to the throne, Elagabalus was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard. The official records state that he was killed for his religious innovations and administrative failures, but the private letters of the conspirators reveal a different truth. They murdered him because they could no longer stomach watching their empire ruled by someone whose personal dysfunction had become a threat to civilization itself. When they found Elagabalus's body in the palace latrine where he had tried to hide, he was clutching a golden locket that contained a miniature portrait of Hierocles. His final words, according to the soldiers who killed him, were not pleas for mercy or assertions of imperial authority, but apologies whispered to a man who had been dead for months. Even in death, the young emperor remained obsessed with the relationship that had destroyed everything he touched. The aftermath of Elagabalus's reign became a cautionary tale that Roman historians would invoke for centuries afterward. Here was proof that unlimited power in the hands of someone psychologically damaged could threaten not just individual lives, but the stability of civilization itself. The boy who had been declared a god before he understood what love meant had used his divine authority to create a hell that consumed everyone around him. Perhaps most tragically, neither Elagabalus nor Hierocles ever had a chance to discover who they might have been under different circumstances. The emperor might have been remembered as a religious reformer or artistic patron, someone whose Syrian heritage brought new perspectives to Roman culture. The gladiator might have won his freedom through valor, started a family, lived the kind of ordinary life that leaves no mark on history but brings genuine happiness to those who experience it. Instead, they became symbols of love, corrupted by power, desire transformed into destruction, and the human cost of a system that treated people as property while declaring some of that property to be divine. Their story serves as a reminder that the most intimate human emotions, love, desire, jealousy, betrayal, become exponentially more dangerous when combined with absolute authority over other human lives. As that Roman soldier cleaned the emperor's blood from his sword in the spring of 222 AD, he might have reflected on the waste of human potential that he had just witnessed. Two young men, both beautiful, both possessing qualities that might have made them beloved figures in a different world, had instead destroyed each other in pursuit of a love that was really just ownership wearing a more attractive mask. The story of Elagabalus and Hierocles reminds us that power without wisdom is dangerous, but power combined with emotional dysfunction can be catastrophic. Their brief, intense relationship demonstrated how private psychological damage can metastasize into public disaster, how individual trauma can echo through history with consequences far beyond its original scope. In the end, what makes their story so haunting isn't just the violence they inflicted on each other, but the glimpses of genuine feeling that occasionally broke through the madness. Ancient sources suggest that there were moments, brief, shining instants, when their relationship resembled actual love rather than mutual destruction. These moments make their ultimate fate even more tragic, because they hint at what might have been possible if power hadn't corrupted everything it touched. The marble halls of the imperial palace still echo with their cries. The elaborate mosaics still conceal the stains of their passion and violence. And somewhere in the shadows of every relationship where power is unevenly distributed, the same ancient dynamics continue to play out with new faces, but the same tragic inevitability. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for both young men comes from a piece of graffiti found carved into the wall of Hierocles' former cell in the gladiator school. Here lived a boy who forgot that survival and love are different things. It could have been written for either of them, a reminder that in a world where people are treated as property, even the masters become slaves to their own worst impulses. The golden locket that Elagabalus clutched in his final moments was buried with him, carrying Hierocles' image into whatever darkness awaits emperors who mistake obsession for love. But their story lives on, a testament to the eternal human capacity for transforming the most beautiful emotions into the most destructive forces, and a warning about what happens when unlimited power meets unlimited need.